Hey fellas, and 0.57 square feet is so 1991. Make way for the future, old man. 0 square feet is here, except at your local game store due to discontinuation. 4 digits spell out the year of the beast, 2016, the year Nintendo got bored one day and said, let's make 3 of these. The NES Classic Edition was a miniaturized replica of the Nintendo Entertainment System, containing 30 built-in titles, a list I like to refer to as Galaga, and 29 other games. I assume Nintendo started production of this thing because, what else did they have releasing in 2016? Jesus. This was an easy way to bump up sales and revenue. It appealed to Nintendo fans, collectors, people interested in trying out the classics for the first time, and people who grew up with these games who haven't really played much since. Oh, and scalpers. Looking at this old graph of the population, the NES Classic Edition appealed to most people with skin. It was cute and functional. And because of Nintendo's boredom, I'd argue that mini-consoles entered a bit of a resurgence in major retail. Ever since the NES Classic's release, these mini-consoles have been more prevalent than ever. This product showed that there was a big market for retro games, and thus... wow. There's so many. Is this a timeline where being lame won? Mini-consoles are nothing new. If you've ever had an event catered by AtGames, you know they've always been into this kind of garbage. But nowadays, you can walk into your local Target and find one of these easily. And if Target isn't your thing, Best Buy will do. Mini-consoles are... sorta everywhere now. So let's take a look at some examples of them all and see if they do the classics justice. Let's go through the big ones so far. We of course wouldn't be here without the 2 main beasts, the NES Classic Edition in 2016 and the SNES Classic Edition in 2017, easily at the top of the food chain. These little things have fantastic build quality, have the essential games for each console, and really give you a good idea of these systems' capabilities. There's just so much love poured into everything about these, the packaging, the menus, the games themselves. These are great love letters to fans of classic Nintendo. And then 2018 happened. This isn't pretty. Tons of companies tried to make mini-consoles, but slightly failed horribly. Starting off with the Neo-Geo Mini, a cheap, tiny arcade cabinet that can be plugged into the TV, but the games look sorta gross, and for whatever reason they took the original Neo-Geo button layout and changed it. The whole point of a mini-console is to evoke nostalgia and bring you back to the past, so what's the point in calling it a mini-console if you're just going to switch the buttons around? Not to mention, the arcade cabinet doesn't even look like the most iconic Neo-Geo arcade cabinet. This isn't even the first of its kind. Every year SNK chucks out another Neo-Geo nostalgia grabber, but as much as it has its place in video game history, it's not big enough for these to be constantly pumped out. Now before you get mad, just remember, I own Sonic Unleashed on the Wii. Do you really think my opinion matters? Now if the Neo-Geo Mini didn't impress me, surely the C64 Mini will win me over. A miniaturized Commodore 64, except it didn't have the rights to call it the Commodore 64. We're off to a great start. It had this mini keyboard, cool, right? It doesn't work and you have to use a digital on-screen keyboard, cool, right? Sure, you can plug in a USB keyboard or whatever, but I will never exert that much energy for a product called this. But of course, the big mini-console release of 2018 was the PlayStation Classic. Hyped up to be this great thing with tons of features and games, this thing was not good. Its main issue is how blatantly rushed it was. You can just tell how it was trying to capitalize on the modern retro mini-console craze that the NES Classic began. One of the biggest problems, in my opinion, is that Nintendo's way better at harnessing nostalgia for their products. A lot of people who own Nintendo consoles play them for the same reasons and games. Mario, Zelda, Pokemon, all of that. Now if you were to put 3 PS1 owners in a room, it's very likely that they all played completely different games. Nostalgia definitely exists for the PS1, but the reliance on third-party games makes it pretty obvious as to why a whole lot of the Mini's game library is, The lineup was bad, the emulation quality was poor, and the price was $100. A heavy emphasis on was, you walk over to IKEA and boom, it's right there in between the couch cushions for $10. That's a beautiful price for this thing I'll never play. Now after the rapture came 2019, where we got the Sega Genesis Mini, which is fortunately great. This thing boasts over 40 games, and the titles included are some of the best. The mainstay Sega games, Konami games, and they even got some licensed Disney games. Now that is cool. This is an excellent little console. After looking through all of those, I could really go for one thing. A working kidney. I have 3 days to live. Hayes, and don't mind me, just recovering from the kidney transplant. You see, I asked the doctor why I was feeling weird, and he says, oh, don't worry, you're just recovering from the transplant. And I said, that makes no sense, the transplant hasn't even happened yet. And he was all like, don't make stupid observations. Yeah, anyways, I found a refurbished kidney online, and to help pay for it, I had to make the tough decision to sell my classic editions, which can only mean one thing. We have to turn to the rip-offs. Everybody wants the mini-consoles, whether they can play Tecmo Bowl or absolutely stink. They're each cool novelties, and even if what's inside of them aren't any good, they're cool miniaturized replicas of the original systems, and best of all, they're all officially licensed. Unless your name is Atari Flashback 7, then you might have a bit of trouble with that. Of course, with popularity comes imitation, no more apparent than with the company that decided to shove their arms knee-deep into the mini-console market, using the grab bag of licenses they had and put out some competition? I don't know. The company I'm of course talking about is none other than AtGames, releasing their plug-and-play tiny consoles from the past to ride alongside Nintendo. So without further ado, let's see how these compare to Nintendo's offerings. AtGames has been making mini Sega and Atari themed plug-and-play since the dawn of time, i.e. 2004. It just so happened that they decided to push them hard when the NES Classic hit the scene. First off is the Atari Flashback 7. AtGames released this thing around the time of the NES Classic, and I gotta say, this little thing ain't half bad. The console mostly resembles the Atari 2600, including 2600-like wireless controllers. Now these, I'm not a massive fan of, the wireless portion that is. These are IR based, much like a TV remote, so you have to keep the controller pointed towards the console at all times. That honestly takes a lot of the convenience out of wireless for me. I'd much rather them include wired controllers, or include Bluetooth functionality. It'd make it more expensive, but I think it'd be worth it. Thankfully, you can use standard Atari controllers, which is probably the best way to go about things. Now the game selection here? Well, it's definitely Atari. The Atari 2600 is one of the most iconic game consoles of all time, but the library just isn't that appealing in this modern day and age. A good amount of the games were never really that great, they were shovelware, and the few that were good back in the late 70s to early 80s aren't that good nowadays. But every now and then you come across a 2600 game that is fantastic. Centipede, Breakouts, Space Invaders, there's a handful of gems here. The lineup as a whole is pretty hit or miss on the Flashback 7, but so is the 2600's library in general. It's lacking any of the Activision classics like Kaboom or Pitfall, which is a shame, but we do get Atari-made classics, and games that were never released. For people who grew up with the Atari or want an idea of what the system is all about, the Atari Flashback series does everything it sets out to do. I doubt it'll capture the hearts and minds of everybody who plays it, but for those who want to appreciate or experience gaming's past, the Flashback 7 does its job. It's still way better to play these games on a real 2600 though. Next up is another AtGames mini console, the Sega Genesis Classic Game Console. This thing gives off Sega Genesis 3 vibes in terms of its size, but the similarities end there. It doesn't feel much like a Genesis aside from that. The system comes with two wireless controllers, which are molded after the 6-button Genesis pads. These definitely aren't on par with actual Genesis controllers, and are also wireless in the same way as the Atari Flashback 7, so definitely plug in a Genesis controller if you have one laying around. This console comes with an actual Genesis cartridge slot, so while a bunch of games are included, if you boot this sucker up with a cartridge in it, you can play your existing Genesis games. Except you should never do that, because this console is revolting. Mainly in the sound department, this thing absolutely murders the audio in these games, just take a listen. This is definitely the biggest issue with this console, the emulation. The video is funny and the sound is atrocious. Other than that, I guess it's okay. It just feels way too generic though. Like the menu system feels very stock generic. Now the Atari Flashback was also made by AtGames, but I think it could get away with the lesser presentation. It was an Atari system, so it made sense to go more basic with its presentation. They're very basic games. It just makes sense. The Genesis had much more of a personality, so it's disappointing to not see that reflected in the system. But hold your horses if you've had any doubts about this system, do I have news for you. The games lineup is pretty tolerable. You get a taste test of the system's library, with games like Comic Zone, Kid Chameleon, a few Sonic titles and the Golden Axe games, whereas standout titles are omitted, such as Streets of Rage 1 through 3, Sonic the Hedgehog 3, and Echo the Dolphin. There exist multiple versions of this console though. This is the 2016 model and these games can be found on older models. But the more you scroll through that game list, the more you'll realise that most of these games are bonus games that are cheaply made, low quality games that were ported over to this console, or just rip-offs of more popular games. Yeah, pretty lame. Overall, the emulation is poor and the games lineup is padded to Kingdom Come. It's cool that you can play actual Genesis cartridges on this thing, but the quality of this product just isn't the best. For the everyday consumer who had a Sega Genesis as a kid, this thing is pretty alright, but for everybody else, this thing ain't too hot. Regardless, whether they're rip-offs or passionate love letters made by the companies behind the originals, these things are really cool. Here's my problem with the mini consoles though. I never play them. I'm not gonna warrant taking up an entire outlet or an HDMI port just for this little box that only plays 20 games, you know? I'd much rather all these games be playable on the modern consoles, and hey, some of them are, but some of them aren't, and that's kind of annoying. It's weird, when they're good, I like these things. Hell, even when they aren't, I still like owning them as miniature replicas of the original systems. But as functional pieces of society, I don't know, man. If you gave me the Sega Genesis Mini in its entirety as a downloadable app on consoles for $60, yeah, I'd buy it, and I play it a whole lot more than the actual Genesis Mini. These things are a complete novelty. I love them, but I do not keep them plugged in. Now I know what you're thinking, Lucas, if you don't play any of these classic editions, and then do you actually play any games? What, a record player, does that count?